So you often hear these enlightened teachers talk about the ego and the mind as the adversary, and the ego is in the way of enlightenment, and the ego is the problem, and the mind is the problem, and all these things, but you never really hear them define what they are talking about. And that's a problem because the ego is just a word. And if you keep saying the ego and repeating the ego and this and the ego that and the mind this and the mind that, it all becomes abstractions in your head. It becomes mental. It has nothing to do with reality because you haven't grounded it in reality. You haven't, defined it to be something that's actually real. It's just a concept, an idea in your head that you're sort of battling against, or that becomes like an adversary, an invisible enemy that you're trying to fight inside or something. And that's not really healthy and not really a good situation if you want to increase your level of consciousness. You always have to ground stuff in reality, which is what I'm all about on this channel and in my ebook. It's all about grounding all these concepts in verifiable reality that everybody can verify for themselves. So that's what I'm going to do here, and in this video I'm going to talk about or define and give clarity about the so-called ego and the mind and what this is about. Because the ego is basically two things at the same time. It's what is installed in you at birth or after birth, which I call the rejection trauma, which creates a trauma-based personality alter inside with all sorts of beliefs and things and negativity, whatever, accumulating around this core, this split off core that is created because of this rejection trauma I talk about in other videos and in my ebook. I can't go into detail about all that now, but that's basically how the ego is. It's the root cause of the ego, or the core of the ego is this artificial personality construct, which I call a single personality disorder, because it's created just like a multiple personality disorder is created from repeated early childhood trauma. This trauma is created from this ego is created, or this alter is created from a single trauma from event from early childhood, which is basically what everybody gets because they're born into a negative world with negative people around them. Even though that negativity might be hidden in the unconscious mind or whatever, it's still there, and the baby still picks it up, and it still becomes like a rejection because it's not unconditional love, which is what it's coming from. So that shock or that trauma creates the initial separation, the initial ego split off, or the ego core, and then you have a lot of stuff accumulating around, like coping mechanisms and whatnot, accumulating around this wounding or this trauma, which becomes your whole inner prison complex or inner personality structure, the artificial self, or whatever you want to call it, the negative ego. So that's the structure, and that's the birth of the ego and how it's born, and how it's it's like it's like the myth of Lucifer in the Bible, of the fallen angel. That's everybody is on this planet, basically fallen angels. That's what we are. In is the ego is born like cast out of heaven, like Lucifer was, and is rebelling and raging against God, which means it's a resistance to the natural self or the flow of your consciousness, which means that you feel unworthy of existence at the deepest level of your personality. And that's what everybody feels. You feel unworthy of existence, which means you also feel unworthy of love, because those two are the same thing. I mean, existence is love. So if you feel unworthy of either of them, you feel unworthy of love, because existence and love is the same. So that's what everybody has. You have this setup of feeling unworthy and unlovable and whatnot at the deepest level of your personality, and usually this is hidden from the person himself or herself, like it's hidden in the background, or unconscious, and people are not really conscious of this, and it creates what I call a compensation drive. And that's the ego in action. So you have the structure of the ego, and then you have the ego in action of what this structure is causing. And that's the compensation drive and the behavior that stems from this compensation drive. And if you look at your own life and you look at the life of other people, you will often or usually be able to see what they are compensating, or what that compensation drive looks like, because this compensation drive is very malleable and can morph into basically anything. But it's always about proving that you're worthy of existing. Basically, that's what you're trying to do in so many ways. And oftentimes people will try to prove themselves on behalf of others, and that's when it gets negative, really negative. It's one thing to prove it for yourself, but I mean, you're already existing when you're proving that you're worthy of existing. So it's kind of a massive paradox. It's the ultimate paradox, the deepest paradox of this realm, or the deepest or most profound Luciferian inversion, so to speak, because it's your basically existence itself is feeling unworthy of existence. That's what it is, because everybody is existence itself. Everybody is reality. That's your deepest identity beneath this artificial construct. So you're basically feeling unworthy of existence while you're existing as existence. So it's a big paradox, but that's the nature of this game, of this earth realm and whatnot. And it's also how we are able to believe that we are just individual bodies, instead of seeing that everybody is one of this one and the same consciousness, and these kind of things. So it's like this setup is necessary if you want to have an experience where you feel like you are a separated body and individual. So the ego is two things. It's the structure of the split off and the trauma-based personality complex, and then the compensation drive, which is how you behave because of this. And it's important, obviously, to be aware of your own compensation and, look at your own behavior. What are you trying to prove? Who are you trying to prove it to? And, do you need to spend so much energy proving yourself to something that's really not, it's pointless, because you're already existing anyway. So you have a right to exist, obviously, and you're worthy of existence, although you don't feel like it. But the point is, you can become aware of this, and you can look at it, and you can sort of minimize or manage it as best you can, this compensation drive. And that can, and especially if you're using other people to sort of lift yourself up and put them down, because that's how you feel more worthy of existing, then that's very negative. So it's important to become aware of this, both in yourself and other people. And when you see people in this with these glasses or this information in mind, you will definitely see them in a different way and what they're doing. And many people, their whole life is dedicated to compensating, and this compensation drive is taking over their entire life, basically. For many people, it is like that. Like, their whole life is trying to prove something, and basically it's because they feel they are unworthy of existing and unworthy of love. So that's really important, obviously. And when it comes to the mind, because you have this compensation drive, is negative, because it's coming from a negativity inside and the trauma and whatnot, you will obviously attract negative thoughts. And that's why the mind is so-called bad or negative, or the adversary, because the mind will support you in whatever you have, whatever setup you have. The mind will support you with thoughts that you attract based on your level of consciousness and your frequency, and this setup. So when the mind doesn't judge, like, in that sense. Okay, this person or this individual or whatever has this setup, the mind has to support you in that by granting you thoughts and impulses and everything, to support that perspective that you get from having this setup, which is distorted, to say the least, in many cases very distorted, depending on how much negativity you have and whatnot. But anyway, the mind will support that setup and basically try to perpetuate that setup, and with the thoughts you attract and whatnot. Which is why it's so important to be aware of your thoughts and establish a distance to the mind and start to observe the thoughts and the mind stuff, instead of believing in what the mind is telling you, whatnot, because then you're running around in circles at best, if not going down the scale. So, and doing negative stuff. So I mean, that's the whole idea about the mind, why the mind is so-called bad. And if you don't have any, in the state of enlightenment or the natural self, you don't have this artificial stuff anymore. You have transcended it. And then you're basically, your mind is silent, because that's the natural state. It doesn't have to talk to you or chat to you, or give you ideas, or support anything, because you're already fully self-supported. You're self fulfilled in that state. So you're just by existing, you're happy, because, or a content, and you feel loved and supported and content, because that's the natural state of existence. So then you don't really need the so-called mind. In that sense, you can still use the mind when you need it to fix, or if you want to calculate something or whatever you need, then you can still use the mind in an enlightened state, obviously. But it doesn't bother you in that sense. It's not a problem anymore, like it is for people who want to get up to scale, because the mind is neutral. It's just supporting the setup and giving you thoughts according to your level, basically building around that level. And when you increase your level and you dismantle this inner complex, this inner ego, then obviously the thoughts you attract will also change and become less negative and more positive up the scale, and obviously also less intrusive and less noisy, and basically you get more and more clarity the higher you go. So the ego is kind of like a Russian doll. You breach one level and then you exist in a larger Russian doll, and so it goes all the way up the scale until you breach the final Russian doll when you basically enter into enlightenment, and that means you're free from the mind and the ego.